Okay, so thank you everyone for being here. And also I'd like to extend thanks to Joe, even though he isn't here, for plucking me out of obscurity and giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Today I'd like to focus on Bitcoin in the business environment. So many of us have come to the understanding that Bitcoin is potentially the best form of money that's ever been invented. But if this is the case, how come there are shops and businesses that are not yet using it on a regular basis? I know many of you are veterans of the Bitcoin space, so it may well be that you've come to your own conclusions about this. But today I want to offer you my perspective as a former business owner who did go through the process of accepting Bitcoin as a payment in my business. And the objective behind this is to maybe help you understand where some of the objections lie, because they may not actually lie where you think they lie. So where they do lie may surprise you, and also where they don't lie may surprise you. So I'm just here to offer you my perspective on that. So my name is Victoria Jones, and I'm a dentist. 20 years ago, I qualified from a London business school, Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. And for the first 10 years of my career, I worked in a number of different businesses, applying my dental skills in businesses that offered NHS services and also private services. And during this process, I was prompted to really look into, what was it that made the difference between NHS care and dental care. And as part of that process, I actually went to the Nottingham University Business School and studied for an MBA, because actually it was, I found those aspects of it quite interesting. Ultimately, I decided that I wasn't able to offer the kind of care that I wanted to offer in the NHS. Most of the dentists are constantly arguing with the government about whether or not they should be funding dental care or not. And so in the end, a little bit like Satoshi, I decided that we needed to start from the beginning. And so I set up my own dental clinic called the Victoria Jones Dental Studio in just over 10 years ago. And I employed all of my resources, financial, emotional, and physical, into creating the best business that I could. I found a smart location in Nottingham and invested money in the best equipment and staff that I could find, including the photobombing videographer, in order to create what I felt was the best possible service for my patients. Now, my timing was pretty horrendous, however, because I did this in December 2007. And so by 9 months later, when my financial resources were getting low, I needed to approach the banks for more funding. And of course, this was September 2008, when no bank was offering money to anybody. And so this was an extremely stressful time. And on top of all of the other learning I'd done about the issues with healthcare, I now found myself doing a deep dive into what is actually money. So, what is money? I actually found myself, whilst I was exploring this, having a conversation with my sister, who was also educated to master's level. And one day we were having a conversation, and I said to her, what do you think actually gives our money value? And her response to me was, our pound notes are representative of a certain amount of gold in the bank. And I had to smile sweetly at her and explain to her that actually our pound notes have not been representing the gold in the bank since 1931. And in fact, no currency anywhere on the planet has been representing the amount of gold in the bank since 1971, when Richard Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard. So what is our money actually? And the clue to this is on our pound notes. And I've got a picture here which shows you in a close-up view, where it's saying, I promise to pay the bearer on demand a sum of £50. But ultimately, what is that £50 representative of? And so, obviously, clearly this is quite a complicated subject, otherwise people would understand it much more clearly than they do. But ultimately, the conclusion I came to is that money is debt. And what Bloomberg reported in the third quarter of last year is that government debt exceeded 65 trillion in 2018, and this was up from 37 trillion just a decade ago. Now, when I was reading this, I thought, well, that's very interesting. I know what £1 million probably looks like. I can possibly also visualize what $1 billion looks like, but what does $1 trillion actually look like? So, if this works, I found this animation that actually demonstrates, what $1 trillion actually looks like. So this is $10,000, $1 million of $100 notes, $1 billion of $100 notes, and this is what $1 trillion looks like. All of these pallets of $1 billion, which would fill an airport runway. And if this is actually translated to the current amount of US debt, it's the equivalent of 20 skyscrapers. Now, I think this animation was made in 2017, and I believe just yesterday, the US debt clock ticked over a grand sum of $23 trillion. Now, where does this leave us? Ultimately, this is something that's happening behind the scenes. And ultimately, in our businesses, we're effectively exchanging numbers in order to exchange value. And although we've been conditioned to believe that these numbers have a certain value, the truth of the matter, when this is going on behind the scenes, is that that value is not equivalent at all. And as British people, we tend to have a very strong sense of fair play. And so actually, it makes it very difficult for our businesses to operate fairly when the means of exchange that we're using on a daily basis is constantly fluctuating. If the government debt can go from 37 trillion to 65 trillion in the space of 10 years, what does that say about the value of the money that we are using on a daily basis? Now, this debt is a problem. Currently, world debt around the world is standing at a grand sum of 244 trillion, which includes corporate debt and also individual debt. Now, many will say, what is to stop this from continuing long into the future? Well, the reality is the debt that is carried by governments, corporations, and individuals is actually someone else's asset. So it's not actually possible to write off the debt without actually writing off a number of people's assets at the same time. And these assets include people's pension funds and liabilities that governments have signed up for into the future. And so there's no way this debt is ever going to be written off. And so history tells us that what tends to happen when this balance gets out of hand is that we tip into hyperinflation. And here we are, picturing Venezuela, of what's now happening to their currency, given that it has now completely lost its value. And you can see that this has been happening around the world, particularly over the last 100 years. This is how the value of currencies have continuously been depleted compared to gold. Now, why is gold valuable? Gold is valuable because it has a property which is known as sound money. So what it means is that when you go into a business, if you're exchanging a gold coin with someone, everybody knows what the value of that gold coin is because there's a limit to the amount of gold that can be created. And by using gold as a means of exchange, it keeps everything fair. Businesses know that they're charging fairly for their services. Customers know that what they're paying is fair because they can make a fair assessment of what they're paying for these services compared to other services, and it helps to keep everything balanced. When we have an economy that's not operating on sound money, it introduces what is known as moral hazards into the decisions that are being made because people are making them with inadequate knowledge. So for me as a business owner, once I understood this and once I understood the danger that the financial system was in, it made me realize, What do I do in a situation where a service I'm charging for £10 one day, I might have to charge for £100 the next day, especially as I had quite a small, select group of clients. If they suddenly were in a position where they weren't able to afford my services, what was likely to happen to my business? And considering that, my business had been extremely tricky to run, especially in the early years, because of lack of finance, this was a serious concern for me. So once I understood that Bitcoin was digital gold, because clearly trying to accept gold and silver coins in my business was going to be a significant challenge, I realized there had to be a digital solution somewhere. And once I realized that Bitcoin had basically programmed in the economic qualities of gold into its software, I realized this was why it was going to be the solution. And you can see here from the slide, you've got a demonstration of what $20 would buy you in 1929, 1960, and 2014, and an equivalent picture of what one Bitcoin would buy you in 2012, 2013, and 2014. So, when it came to my motivations for introducing Bitcoin as a form of payment into my business, the financial crisis of 2008 really focused my mind on what Bitcoin is and how to protect my business financially. What I also realized was that, if we tip into a situation of hyperinflation by starting to educate my patients as to what Bitcoin was and give them the opportunity to pay in Bitcoin, I was effectively starting to help protect my customers and therefore protect my patient base. Because if all of my customers were already introduced to what Bitcoin was, the chances were, if we ever tipped into a situation of hyperinflation, they will have already been coached and educated as to what it was, and they will be well aware that if they needed dental treatment, I'd be somewhere where they could go and they'd be able to get that service because they would have something of value which would allow them to pay for it. The other things that influenced me were the fact that when I was running my business, the card machine kept breaking. It really was a nightmare, and actually, the more business owners I spoke to, I realized that this is actually quite a common problem. And it's not something that you really think about before you actually own a business yourself. I mean, all of us go around and we're happy to pay using our payment cards, and most of the time it's not a problem. But on the other side of it, if the card machine breaks, it's a real problem. The only thing a customer can do in that situation is to go around the corner and get some cash out of the bank, or you need to trust them to actually call you later and give them their card details over the phone so that you can accept the payment then. The other issue is that, this card machine isn't actually taking the payment and depositing it straight into my bank account. There's actually an intermediary that's collecting the payment and then depositing it into my bank account. And, over the last few years, we're hearing more and more about banks having problems with their online services. And there were a couple of times when, payment transfers that should have taken 3 days were actually taking 5 days to enter my bank account. Now, fortunately, by the time this was happening, the business was a lot more stable. But certainly in the early days, this would have given me a really big problem. So, those were other motivations as well. I'd say the biggest motivation was understanding the state of the financial system, but also, just the process of accepting the payment, had its issues. And not only that, the intermediary required a fee whenever I collected those payments as well, which ended up, being coming off the top line of your revenue, has an exponential effect on your bottom line. So that was an interest for me as well. The other issue I had was, I was offering private services. So, the services I was offering was quite expensive. And often, one of the complaints I would get from patients would be about the fact that the business was too expensive. But of course, if I'm offering a business that has, very expensive expenses, I have to pass that on to my clients, especially if I'm not being subsidized by the government. And so the only way I have of funding my business is the charges I'm making to my clients. So, by introducing them all to Bitcoin, I felt I might help them to feel a little bit wealthier, and then they'd have less reason to complain about what I was charging them, because I'd help them to become richer in the process. Also, around the time that I was looking at this, recently there'd been the issue of the Cyprus banks, where a number of the banks had anyone with, I think it was a deposit over 100,000, was confiscated, and which was fine if you're very wealthy, but a lot of businesses will often hold quite high balances in their bank accounts. So again, if there was a sudden crisis that required something like that, it would mean that the capital of the business was potentially in jeopardy. Now, of course, most of us live fairly comfortably and securely because none of these problems have ever happened to us in the past. But just because they've never happened to us in the past doesn't mean they couldn't happen to us in the future. And actually, if you're mindful of history and aware of the other things that are going on in the world, you start to realize that actually there's no reason why this couldn't happen to us in the future. In fact, all we're really waiting for is a significant trigger point where this could certainly, spring to mind. So I think that's where I'll leave that for the moment. So once I decided that I wanted to accept Bitcoin as a payment method in my business, the next thing I wanted to do was inform my staff and train them on how to accept payments at reception. I also produced an information leaflet which told my clients, how to buy Bitcoin and how to store it safely. I then displayed this at the front desk. I would issue it with their treatment plans, and I would also allow a line at the end of the treatment plan to explain that, Bitcoin was now a method of payment that we were taking. In terms of the payment itself, this was very straightforward. I just found an old iPhone that I had, and I installed an app on it, and so it was a very straightforward procedure just to show my staff how to open this app, and when anyone came in for a certain service, if they wanted to pay with Bitcoin, all they had to do was press the number, and this would generate the QR code that they needed. This sounds very straightforward, but for a normal brick-and-mortar business, this was more than sufficient. It didn't require any complex implementation. I wasn't buying or selling anything online. I wanted to collect the Bitcoin. I wasn't interested in necessarily selling it straight away because I understood its value as a long-term investment. So the process of actually accepting the Bitcoin payment itself was very simple. The one thing I would point out, though, is that once I had informed all of my patients that I was prepared to accept Bitcoin as a payment method, particularly as most of my clients were pretty well educated, what I discovered that even though they knew about it and some of them were buying it, not one single person paid me in Bitcoin the whole time that I was giving them that opportunity. And I put this down to something called Gresham's law. In economics, there's a law which talks about the fact that, if there is good money and bad money in an economy, bad money will tend to drive out the good money because people will want to spend the bad money first. And in this particular circumstance, I think, my patients who were starting to understand the value of Bitcoin, especially as the year that I was doing this was 2017, for every day that they owned it, they were getting richer and richer. So why would they want to spend it? They could spend the normal currency as well. So, the conclusion I came to that, is if a business wanted to accept normal payments and Bitcoin payments in parallel, one of the ways they could perhaps incentivize their clients to pay in Bitcoin rather than the normal fiat currency might be to actually offer different forms of discounting. And of course, they could fluctuate this depending on where the price of Bitcoin might be in its price cycle. But of course, there's a learning curve involved in implementing all of that. But I think the main message here is understanding what Bitcoin is and its value is the first important step in terms of implementing this in people's businesses. The other thing that I think it's important to bear in mind for businesses is that, it's not just about what happens with the services at the front end. They also have a lot of work to do in terms of keeping track of their transactions. Every year they need to have a meeting with their accountant to go through the payments they've taken in order to work out their tax bills. And this can be quite a laborious thing to do and quite expensive. So if you're introducing a new form of currency into the equation, this is going to be more time-consuming and likely more costly in the fees they're going to be paying for their accountant. So again, this is something that needs to be borne in mind when businesses are thinking of taking on an additional payment method, because clearly this will be an additional burden for them as well. The other thing they also need to think about is their tax burden. In 2018, last year, HMRC reviewed all of their guidelines regarding Bitcoin payments, and they haven't banned them completely, but certainly it's more of a burden to work out the value of the Bitcoin that you're accepting at one point and the value of it when you decide to sell it. If there's a difference there, there's a tax burden associated with that, and clearly calculating all of that and keeping track of it is an additional workload and also an additional cost when it comes to working with their accountants as well. So in summary then, what I would like to point out is, I think the barriers for businesses accepting Bitcoin, the biggest one is actually understanding what money is. Because certainly, as a dentist, I still go to meetings with dentists, and most of them do not have the foggiest. And, I think this is true of a lot of the population. Most people have never been educated as to what money is. They've never been in a situation where they've been forced to work it out. And so, most people are carrying on with their lives as if everything is the same, and they are completely unaware of the danger that may soon be facing them. So this is the second point I've made, understanding the danger that their business is in, because businesses that are trying to operate in a situation of hyperinflation, it's very dangerous, especially if they are relying on a select group of clients. If their clients' finances are suddenly under threat, that's going to have a direct threat to the business as well. Their existing workload, running a business is actually a very tricky thing to do, requires juggling a number of balls at the same time. There's so much legislation that's being added to businesses all of the time, which is making it harder and harder for them to operate. And of course, introducing a new learning curve to them at this point in time is, an additional barrier, and something that, again, needs to be factored into their already busy and complicated lives, which is likely to be difficult. So, unless there's a situation where it's suddenly critical for them to learn about this, the chances are they're not going to, because they're not going to realize the importance of it. And then, of course, we've got the accounting barriers and the legal barriers as well, which is what I've already mentioned. So I hope that's enlightening for you, and that it's given you an idea of what real businesses are actually struggling with. I know there seems to be a lot of focus on how to get Bitcoin businesses to actually accept the Bitcoin payment, but as you can see from this presentation, the actual accepting of the payment, in my case, was the easiest thing. Also, at this moment in time, it's the thing people are least likely to pay with. But if you are going to get a business to start considering accepting Bitcoin, there's a learning curve that they need to go on, and they also, there's a huge barrier for them in understanding exactly how important it is and why they should even be interested. So that's all I have to say for today. My name is Victoria. Like I said, I've got 2 Twitter accounts. One's Victoria Dentist, and the other one is Satoshi's Page. I'm currently in the process of writing a book about businesses accepting Bitcoin payments, which I'm hoping to publish in December. So if you're interested in that, please follow me on Twitter, because I'll be keeping you updated on that. Or if you'd like to engage with me on an individual basis on these subject matters, I'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Someone's coming.
So, It sounds like you don't think that the future of Bitcoin is going to be led by merchant adoption.
No, I do think it will be.
You do think it will be?
Yes, because I think if there's a financial crisis, I think that will be the trigger point. Certainly for myself as a business, it was understanding that may be on the horizon that made me want to prepare for it and educate my clients about it.
Okay, so that you can answer my question, because I was going to say, how do you see Bitcoin reaching adoption primarily because of Gresham's law, and that as being a barrier to adoption for merchants?
Yeah. So, I think the point I was trying to make that, in a situation where it is hyperinflation, if you've got a situation where the service that you're offering is £10 one day and then £100 the next week, but if you're holding Bitcoin that allows you to buy more the following week, whereas your existing currency isn't allowing you to buy the same amount of goods, that Bitcoin is holding your purchasing power. And it's not only holding the purchasing power of the customer, it's also holding the purchasing power of the business. Because if you're accepting Bitcoin and it's going up in value because we're in a situation of crisis such as hyperinflation, then it means the business can continue to pay their bills, they can continue to pay their staff, and they can continue to operate. Whereas, if you look at examples of other countries that are operating in this situation, a lot of them end up failing because, they lose their customers. The customers have no money, so they can't buy their services. It's a very difficult situation. Anybody else?
Yeah, do you think once people realise, after getting into Bitcoin, let's say 5-10 years from now, once people realise and businesses and merchants realise the true power of privacy-based crypto assets, the fungibility, peer-to-peerness of them, once they realise the true powers of those, do you think that'll be a big threat to governments and banks?
I think a lot depends on how it plays out. Obviously, I know there are lots of other projects that are trying to extend the idea of Bitcoin. But of course, for us, we're kind of a unique niche in that we even understand Bitcoin at this level. So I think expecting people to kind of go one step beyond right at this point in time is a really difficult thing to say. I think at the moment it's a bit of a struggle to understand exactly how Bitcoin's going to play out, let alone everything else. So I think it remains to be seen. At the moment, Bitcoin has the most value because it's got the biggest network effects. So I think that gives it the most makes it the most likely candidate to be the first thing people run to in a financial crisis. But there's so much that could change in that time that could influence the development of the other coins. It's just a really difficult thing to predict right now. But it's good that people are working on them because we just don't know what we might need in that situation. Yeah. Okay, anyone else?
All right.
Okay, thanks
so
guys.
much.